Paul Volstead again. I'd like to continue talking about data models, introducing the basic vector and raster structures and the geographic attribute components of features inside these data models. And the trade-offs in resolution, area, accuracy, and time, you have to pick what you want to optimize. Finally, I want to go over the common kind of attributes we have: nominal, ordinal, and interval ratio. So as I said last time, most of our GIS layers are stored and manipulated in this Cartesian coordinate system, this right-angle coordinate system. And those consist of the axes oriented and in a set location, and then a set of coordinate pairs that define features. So I might have a polygonal lot data set where I have the cadastral data with the lot boundaries, and I have a set of coordinates that define an individual lot plus the attributes associated with it: the number, the street, the town, and many other things I deem important or relevant. And so there's these two important parts. There are these axes which I have to specify for a particular data layer or set, and then there are the coordinates that define the location of objects in this axis or geographic space. Now there's two ways we generally record data. There's the vector data model here on the left and the raster data model here on the right. So this vector data model on the left has points which are just a coordinate pair, and there might be a bunch of them that are unrelated to each other except they're in the same thematic layer. So those might be things like fire hydrants or light poles or other things that I only need one coordinate to identify the center location of. They're lines, which are a series of vertices that are in an order, and so I know I connect from the first one to the last one along that set of coordinates, or areas, which are sets of coordinates that close back on themselves. So I'm defining features by their bounding coordinates if that's important. Now there's no information in the space in between where features aren't declared or defined. It's just there's nothingness, and I have individual features easily identified by the sets of coordinate pairs. Now, a raster data set, we split the world up into kind of a checkerboard that has a fixed dimension, and points are just occupying a particular cell, a grid cell there. Lines are a set of cells that are contiguous or sharing an edge or a corner, and areas then are a set of cells that are contiguous and are more than one cell thick, one cell wide. I can represent all manner of features in point, line, and polygon layers. So points don't have to be necessarily small features. They usually are things like light poles or fire hydrants, but they can be the center of polygons. Here I have lakes, and in many lake or pond features, you have a single point in the middle. Areas typically do have a dimension and are aerial features we're interested in. So they might be land cover, or lakes, or a stadium. And lines are typically linear features. Now, these features may have width, so we may have a braided river channel, but we're going to represent it with a line that in theory has no width at all. The width may be stored as an attribute, but I'm not going to store the two edges, but rather just one line that identifies the center course. Again, in our vector data set, we typically have a one-to-one relationship here. So we'll have a table, and the table associated with a feature. So I'll have, for example, a entry here, 1 for Hodson Hall, that corresponds to a polygon, and 2 Borlaug Hall that corresponds to another polygon. There's a one-to-one relationship all the way down the line. There's 9 polygons and 9 entries, and so I have a correspondence, and all the attributes that are associated with a particular polygon are in a particular row. Now, I can do the same thing with points, where it's a point feature, or with a line or a line segment. Sometimes I'll have several lines, and then I'll be a row in the table for that, excuse me, row in the table for that particular feature. Now, there's often a bunch of structure that you don't see in the data model. So in our geographic depiction or in our conceptualization, there'll be polygons and then a connection to an attribute table. We can look back and forth at both of those. But there's a lot of indexing going on in the vector model underneath, where The polygons might be made up of lines that are made up of nodes and vertices that are made up of coordinates. And these are all linked together so they can rapidly and efficiently grab those and manipulate those and work through those. So there's a lot of structure to the raster that's hidden beneath the surface. It's quite a complicated coordinate, or I should say, data model. Rasters, on the other hand, are relatively simple. They're usually parallel to the x and y axes, and you have a cell starting location and a fixed cell dimension. And if you know that, then you can navigate to anywhere in the raster space. So they're often used for representing continuously varying features like a pollution density in water, or a salinity density, or some other chemical density, or elevation, or other things that vary across space. If we burrow into the raster, we can see the individual cells, each of these having a value. And burrow in further, then the raster is basically just this matrix of cell values. Now, a couple of things. Rasters typically take more volume than vectors for a given area. That's not entirely true. It depends on the theme of interest. But raster is usually representing continuous features, and it takes a lot of volume to represent the continuous variation. There's a trade-off, though, and there's two key questions you have to ask at the start of any analysis. What's the grain size, the smallest thing you want to resolve, and the extent? And in a vacuum, you might say, well, I want the biggest area I can get at the finest level of detail. The problem is somebody has to pay for that. And as the resolution increases, so if I have a coarse to very fine resolution, a kilometer to a centimeter, a mile to an inch, the data volumes increase, and they increase exponentially because of the squared nature of spatial data. From small to large areas, the data volumes also increase because of the squared nature. So if you have a large area at a fine resolution, you have to multiply these times each other, and things get huge and expensive. Another thing you don't often think about is that the data error often increases the larger the area that you work over. You have to do things like tile together separately collected photos or images, and that introduces some error. You just have more area to collect, so people get tired in collecting data. And as the grain increases, right, so if you get finer grain, the cost for a fixed accuracy increase. It's much harder to keep things accurate at a very fine level of detail. And so large extents and fine grain are more expensive and have more errors associated with them. So there's this trade-off. How much are you willing to pay for the level of error that's acceptable? And so you'll usually identify a minimum error threshold. If it's any worse than a meter, these data are no good to me. And then you try and collect data in the most efficient way for as big an area as you can. And you see this in data. Sometimes you're collecting data, gathering it from the internet for some kind of project, and there's this trade-off of sampling accuracy versus cost. These are data that are from a global shoreline database. If I zoom in on that global shoreline database, looks good at this scale, but zoomed in, you can see, well, they're collecting for the entire globe, so they're cutting some corners. They're omitting whole islands or cutting off peninsulas, or basically very much generalizing an edge, right? It fits their data needs. Now, I can go to a more carefully developed, expensive, very detailed data set, and I'll omit some of those errors. The question is, can I get these kind of data at this level for the entire globe? Maybe this is data just for a region. And even if I zoom in with that higher quality data at a much finer scale, when you start to see individual patches, there's still the same problems. There's errors of omission. There's sort of sampling along the edge, this sort of sampling to reveal the errors at a smaller grain. So really, you have to realize all data have some sampling, that resolution and grain error. You just have to ensure that that error is below the spatial dimension that's important to you. If you're mapping the home range of caribou and below a few hectares, an acre, it doesn't matter to you, then an accuracy that's accurate to within 100 feet, 30 meters, which is about half the dimension of an acre, is good for you. So you have to really make that trade-off and then decide what is acceptable, and either not do the project, get more budget, or change how you're going to do the analysis. So We have attribute data associated with each of these polygons. There's nominal data, ordinal data, and interval ratio data for the most part. We also sometimes have other data like recorded images or recorded videos. Those are less common but still occur in spatial data. So the nominal data imply no rank. They're just identifiers: country, country name, some broad category where you can't say one category is different, better than another, bigger, smaller. It's different, that's all. There's ordinal data, which identifies categories but also has an implied rank. One is bigger than two, but one isn't necessarily twice as big as two. So you have how things line up, like oldest to youngest car, but the oldest car may be 20 years old, and the next youngest car may be 2 years old, and then a year old, and then 2 months old. So the intervals aren't necessarily the same in the order. Then there's interval ratio, which is the integer real data that measures things like population or population density or temperature or elevation, right? So land cover data here is nominal data, right? It has corn, cotton, rice. Those are different in kind, but you can't say one is bigger than the other or longer than the other. Human appropriation of primary productivity is a number along a scale that has some scientific meaning, so that's interval ratio data. Population counts, again, although it's integer, it's still interval ratio data. 1,000 people is twice as much as 500 people. And then violent crime rates by state, this is ordinal data, so there's 3 categories: highest, lowest, and in between. But you don't know if Minnesota and Idaho are pretty close or way far apart. They're just in the same category of lowest. South Dakota or Texas or Arkansas, you don't really know if they're 4 times as high as Colorado. New Mexico is 4 times as high as Colorado, or just a little bit higher than Colorado. It's ordinal. It's just they're in those 3 categories. So data models, right? We have them for each of our themes. There's basically a vector representation where we keep track of the boundaries and structure that, and we don't know anything about anything in between. There's the raster representation, which is kind of a 2-dimensional rug across the landscape where every cell has a value at a fixed resolution. We have the attribute components that go with these geographic components of the features. And there are trade-offs in how well we record things because of this difficulty in maintaining accuracy over large areas at fine resolutions. So we have to do some kind of sampling in the geographic space to meet whatever our needs are. And we always have to evaluate our data in these data models to meet the sampling we need. Finally, we have attributes that are associated with each of the features. They're nominal, ordinal, or interval ratio for the most part of those 3 different types. We have to be careful and keep that in mind when we do our analysis further on down the line, because there's some analytical tools that are appropriate for interval ratio but aren't appropriate for nominal data and vice versa. And we'll cover that more when we come to the analysis. Just you have to think about it.